It's Sunday, May 29th. Welcome to the teachings Brewster Friends Church for this Sunday. Wish you all a happy Memorial Day weekend, especially to those of you who have served and to those of you who have lost loved ones in service. We thank you for your sacrifice and what it means for us. We, of course, today concentrate on the freedom that we have in Jesus Christ, in the sacrifice that He made for us. And in doing so, I want you to just take a moment and I want you to imagine for a second that you were born blind. Now, the truth is, none of us can really imagine that. We don't really know what that's like. We can only guess. But we can figure some of it out. I mean, imagine for a second you could say those words about yourself, that you were born blind. Imagine that you've never seen anything. Imagine that you've never seen the grass. You feel it beneath your feet, but you don't know what it looks like. You've never seen the sun whose warmth you feel. You've never seen your parents, whose home you live in and who take care of you. You've never seen your home itself or the streets that you walk on every day. You've never seen colors or lights or trees or flowers or insects or animals. Nothing. Ever. You've only really seen one thing. Darkness. Just darkness. Now imagine being in a dark room and not being able to turn the lights on. Ever. We've all lived in darkness. We've all been in that place where we can't really see where we're going. We can't see the things ahead of us, but because we have sight, eventually we can catch glimpses of light and we can catch things in the darkness, but not with blindness. It is pitch black all the time. You can't see anything. Now, in Jesus' day, people had a lot of questions about blindness, about what caused blindness, particularly whose fault it was. They believed that God caused this blindness because of sin. But the question that they would ask was, whose sin caused it? So, in John chapter 9, it tells us about a day that Jesus walks and he sees a blind man. And the disciples ask him that question. You know, whose sin was it that caused this man's blindness? Whose sin was it that caused this man to live in this eternal darkness where the lights never come on? Did he sin? Or did his parents sin? Some people believed the parents would sin and their child would suffer a punishment because of it. They would ask, what if he was born blind? If he never seen anything, how could he have sinned? Well, some people believe you could actually sin in the womb. And the blindness came as a result of the sin that you committed in the womb. But Jesus doesn't answer the question the way that anybody would expect. He tells them blindness isn't about sin. It's not his sin or its parents' sin that's to blame for this blindness. It's in verse 3 of chapter 9. Jesus answers them, it's not because of his sin or his parents' sin. This happened so the power of God can be seen in him. Jesus points not to blame. He doesn't say this sin or that sin. Blindness is a punishment. No, he said blindness is an opportunity for the power of God to be put on display. So Jesus heals the man in his blindness. In verse 6 it tells us, and then he spit in the ground and he made mud with saliva and he spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. Now, the whole scene seems pretty disgusting to us, right? Our modern viewpoint says spitting into the ground and making mud with it and then spreading it on somebody's face is nasty. But in those days, the spittle of a holy man was viewed as having healing powers. Jesus does it in other places in the Gospels. And the mud pack, the clay that he makes, we can associate with the very first act of God's power on the account of humans, how he created us out of dust. The very earth he created us with is how he creates this man's sight. And the waters of the same pool of Siloam that we talked a few weeks ago, that were part of this water ceremony that during the Feast of Tabernacles. Those same waters washed away this man's blindness, like the waters of the Jordan River washed away Naaman's leprosy. Siloam itself, John tells us, means sent. And many believe that is a symbol Jesus used to show that he was the sent one of God. And now here, he was sending this man to the pool. See, Jesus does everything with intention. He didn't need the spittle. He didn't need the mud. He didn't need the pool. But he uses these as symbols. And it's not just symbols, though. He also meets people where they are. I mean, if you were this man, if you've been born blind, and all you've heard your whole life is this question being asked, whose fault is this? And your parents tell you, you must have done something in the womb. And other people point to your parents and say, they must have done something outside the womb. This man has no faith. He's been told from the day he was born that he was cursed by God because of sin. He'd been told that God has no regard for him. This man had no hope. Nothing could change blindness. Nobody even imagined that there was a day coming where God would send somebody who could change blindness. In fact, today, if you're blind like this, it's not like there's some procedure that doctors use to restore your sight. Blindness like this doesn't get cured. Jesus, with what he does, meets this man at his level of faith. This had to be something that this man would have seen as something that could heal him. And it does. He goes to the pool blind, and he comes back seeing. And then we're told in verse 8 that he goes into his neighborhood. Or somehow his neighbors see him. And they knew him as the blind beggar. And they even asked the question, isn't this the guy who used to be sitting and begging? Isn't this the blind man? And others said, no, it just looks like him, because it is unimaginable that the guy who was blind could be walking around. But the beggar tells them, yeah, it's me. I'm the same guy. And they start to ask questions about his healing, and he healed him. And he says in verse 11, the man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. These questions lead to them taking him to the Pharisees. And we believe that people's intentions were good, that they see that this man has been healed, and they got more questions. But for the Pharisees, it turns into this debate because this happened on Sabbath day. And they debate whether this proves that Jesus is from God or not from God because of it. If he can't be from God because he healed on the Sabbath, and others say, well, he's got to be from God because he healed blindness. And so they call the beggar, the formerly blind man, in to question him. And in verse 17, it says the Pharisees, they question him a bunch and ask him about what happened, and he tells them, and they debate some more, and the blind man's there. And so verse 17, they ask him again. They demand, it says, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? See, they're debating their opinions about the man. Now they're saying, you met this guy, he healed you. What's your opinion? And the blind man, the beggar, says, I think he must be a prophet. Meaning, he's listened to this debate and saying he's got to be from God somehow. He'd been listening to this back and forth by religious leaders, something which, by the way, he would probably have never heard before. Something that he couldn't have been a part of as a blind man. And he realized in listening to them, there has to be something more going on. There's got to be something about this man they call Jesus. So the Jewish leaders that are there, the Pharisees, whoever's listening, They do the only thing they can do. They refuse to believe the man was blind. That's their answer. Because, see, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that this guy can be from anything other than God and heal a blind man. So the only answer is, well, then the guy must not have been blind. So they call his parents in. They question his parents. And his parents, they know, they don't want to be in trouble. They don't want to be kicked out of the synagogue for the rest of their lives. So they say, hey, listen, we don't know what happened, but that is our son, and he's been blind since birth. And the rest, you need to ask him about, because we don't know. So again, they call the blind beggar back in. Again, they call the guy who used to be blind in. And he says to them this, verse 24. God should get all the glory for this. This is their question. God should get all the glory for this because we know this man Jesus is a sinner. And the blind man says, the formerly blind man, I don't know whether he's a sinner, but I know this, I was blind and now I can see. So they threaten him. They're not really questioning him now. They say, we know. You got to stop saying Jesus did this. God had to do this. See, they can't use their first excuse that he's not blind. Okay, he had to have been blind. But it's not Jesus. God did this somehow. And you can't give Jesus credit because we look at that word. We know for a fact this guy Jesus is a sinner. The guy says, I don't know. I don't know about this guy. I don't know about his life. I don't know whether he sinned. The only thing I know is I was blind and now I can see. It's an unescapable fact the Pharisees won't recognize. So they start to question him again. What did he do to you? How did he heal you? Verse 26. And the man says, look, I told you once. Didn't you listen? Do you want to hear again? Do you want to become his disciples too? And then that makes them mad. Because they're disciples of Moses. And he says, they said, we don't even know where this guy came from. And he says in verse 30, that's very strange. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he's ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has ever been able to open the eyes of someone who's been born blind. And if this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. Now they're mad and tell him he's blind. He was born a total sinner. And now he's trying to teach us, and they kick him out. They twist his words. They use them against him. They're disciples of Moses, which they're implying that he's not. But the man's response is this. Look at what's happened. This guy has to have come from God. He can't be some sinner. Because nobody's even suggested that anybody can heal blindness. Here I was my whole life, and nobody's ever told me that this curing blindness thing is a possibility. We know that God's the only one that can do it. So you don't know where he came from? He had to come from God. And they kick him out. Why? Because they're allergic to the truth. They don't want to hear the logic, the reasoning that this formerly blind beggar has. Because that doesn't fit their own agenda. Now do you realize that at no point did the man that actually, the formerly blind man, at no point does he actually meet Jesus. He hasn't talked to Jesus. He didn't come back and find Jesus. Jesus spit in the ground, made mud, wiped on his eyes, he cleaned it, and then that's it. That's the extent of his encounter with him. Verse 35 tells us that Jesus hears what happens. Here's what happens in the synagogue. Here's what happens with the Pharisees. And he comes and finds the man. And he says this, verse 35 again. Do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. And Jesus said, you have seen him, and he's speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said, and he worshipped Jesus. Now, don't miss the details in Jesus' words. He asks him if he wants to believe in the Son of Man. That's a messianic term. Do you want to believe in the Messiah? Do you want to know him? Do you want to believe in him? And the man says, of course I do. See, because we've changed. At the beginning, this isn't a man who would have thought that he could have known and seen the Messiah. But now his life's been changed. Yes, I want to see him. I want to believe. And Jesus says, you've seen him. Now, Jesus could not have said that to the man at the start of the day. Only now. Only having encountered Jesus and found the healing and change that he can bring, can the man actually now see Jesus. And the man proclaims his belief and begins to worship Jesus. That means he bows down at his feet. He recognizes fully that this isn't just a man. This isn't just somebody from heaven. This is God. Now, we look at this bigger story. Another one of John's really long encounters between Jesus and a person. But I think there's a couple of important things to this passage. There's a lot here. But as I read it this week, there was one really important theme that really stood out to me, that really was clear to me, and that God laid on my heart. And that theme was this, simply: change. It's not our favorite word, change. Yet it's a word that we all recognize that we need in our lives. And it's easy to see the apparent change. I mean, the man was blind at the start and he can see at the end. So of course he changes. But there's more to it than that. When we look at this passage, it's a whole process of change. How this man's life, it's not just his ability to see the changes. His entire life changes in that day. Beyond just his blindness. And in looking at the changes that happen in this man, it helps us to see what change looks like in our lives. And so I challenge you right now to begin to think, what needs to change? Not just like what needs to change at my workplace, well, not just, what needs to change about my diet, not those kind of things. Big change. Because we're talking about a fundamental life change here. The guy was blind and how he can see. Something that turns his life completely upside down. What change needs to be brought to your life that you can't bring to yourself, that God needs to bring? Think about, as we talk about this process of change, what God can change in your life. Well, change begins in this passage with taking our focus off the past. See, everybody's question is, what caused a man's blindness? Whose fault is it? What in the past is causing this problem in the present? And if they were able to decipher that theological debate and they pinned the blame on someone, what would that have helped? How would it have changed anything for the blind man? It wouldn't. Because there's no answers in the past. There's no help in the past. Sometimes we get stuck trying to change by rehashing and revisiting the past when change is fundamentally a future-focused endeavor. It's when we take our focus off the past and put it on the future that we can position ourselves to find real and meaningful change in our lives. 2, change often occurs in the midst of brokenness and suffering. See, blindness is central to everything in this man's life. And this problem he has defines everything about who he is. It defines how people deal with him and see him. Sometimes we think to ourselves, when I solve my problem, then I can start to really think about change. When I get my life or my mind or my relationship or my career to a better place, I can change. But I want you to see that the problems, the brokenness, the sickness, the suffering is often the very place where we experience change. It's not when I get everything fixed, then I change. That's the change. And it's often in the midst of our lowest moments and our deepest pains that we experience the most significant changes. Problems, pain, sufferings, they are not an obstacle to change. They are the opportunity for change because they're the opportunity for God to work. 3, change is the work of the power of God in us. The reason the pain, the problem, the sufferings, or opportunity are a catalyst for change is because they're an opportunity for God to use His power in our lives. The blind man with the greatest unfixable problem of anybody in that place is the one that ends up seeing Jesus, while the people with good lives miss out on Him. He's the only one that recognizes Jesus as the Messiah that day. Why? Because his problem was the catalyst for change. Not just change in his physical life, but change in his heart. His blindness was an opportunity for God to work in his life. So don't run away from the problems or obscure the brokenness or wallow in the sadness or ignore them. See them as the place where God will meet you, the place where God will work, the place where you get to see God's power and what it can do. Next, the only ingredient of change that mattered were the hands of Jesus. See, it's easy to get distracted by the spittle, the mud, the clay, the pool, all the things that Jesus uses to heal this man, but none of that really matters. Jesus doesn't use it because he needs it. He uses it for the sake of that man. The only ingredient that mattered was the hands of Jesus. The change you need in life isn't about who you are, or who your family is, or who your kids are, or who your friends are, or what your job is, or how much money you make, or any of the other things that we sometimes think are the catalyst to real change in our lives. Jesus is the only ingredient that matters in change. Stop thinking about who I am or what surrounds me. Jesus is all that matters. Next, we see that change requires action, because Jesus doesn't just heal the man. He doesn't just touch the man. He made the man get up and go to the pool. The pool that means sent. He sent him to the pool. It's a much more difficult task than it sounds. He's a blind man. He surely would have needed help to get there. But he doesn't let his shortcomings become an excuse to do nothing. He doesn't say, I'm blind, I can't. No, he takes action. He gets up and he moves and he's healed. You cannot change your life if you keep doing what you're doing. You cannot change your life if you keep being who you're being. You cannot change your life by continuing to do the same tired things and trusting in the same tired answers and in the same people that haven't worked. You cannot change your life with nothing. Change requires action. Next, we see that change starts with the problem, not finishes. Excuse me. Change starts with the problem. It's not a promise that God is going to fix every problem. Excuse me again. In fact, we have some cases where God tells people, no, I'm not going to take away your problem. For instance, the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 12 about a problem he calls a thorn in his flesh. And 3 times he begs God to take it away from him. And many of you already know God's answer. God tells him, no, because my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in your weakness. You see, God does not have to change your problem for his power to be on full display. He didn't change Paul's problem, but what he did was he changed Paul's perspective on it. He couldn't move on from it and allow God's power to be displayed in him until he dealt with that problem. God dealing with the problem is not the promise of a magic wand to make it go away. God dealing with the problem is the promise to deal with you in his power, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. Even if the problem's still present, God is still working change in you. What that means is Jesus could have changed that man's life without changing his blindness. Now, he chose in that day to change his blindness and show God's power that way to everyone around him. Sometimes the problem doesn't change, but the problem changes you. And it gives you the change that you really need. Next, we see that change will be noticed. When God works, people notice. When the blind man goes back to his neighborhood, the people that know him can see him, and they say, hey, that can't be the same guy because he's not blind anymore. Perhaps the change in your life won't be so startling as a blind man having sight, but when God works, people see it. They'll notice it, and they end up being drawn to him by it. Next, we see the change isn't always accepted. Noticing it wasn't always positive. Some people didn't like the change. Some people called it a lie. Some people questioned him. You think that everyone would be going nuts about something like this, and they've never even heard of the possibility of a blind man getting sight. It's something they thought was impossible that not even God would do. But their bias, their prejudice, their agenda, their pride, their selfishness refused to allow them to see any positive change. And in doing so, they rejected what God was doing right in front of them. Next, we see that change continues by recognizing that it came from Jesus. When the people in the neighborhood ask, how did this happen? The blind man says, a man named Jesus did it. He doesn't want to talk to them about mud and spittle. He doesn't want to talk to them about pool of siloam. He doesn't say, oh, I put mud on my eyes and washed myself in the pool of siloam. No, a man named Jesus did this. He doesn't even say, oh, I washed my eyes in the pool. He doesn't take credit for it. A man named Jesus did this to me. Sometimes we give too much credit to the books, to the people, to the sermons, the podcasts, to the conversations, to whatever vessel that God uses in our lives. But whatever they are, they're just spittle and mud. It's Jesus who changes you. So stop thinking about the spittle and mud and what spittle and mud do I need in my life. No, you need Jesus. Put the recognition where it belongs. Next, we see that change comes in, it starts when we see Jesus differently. What we miss is the real change that happens in this man. Because a blind man seeing is amazing. But coming to stare into the eyes of the promised Messiah, the hope of the world, tops even a cure for blindness. Look at how the man who was changed evolves in this passage, just in how he talks about Jesus. In verse 11, he's talking to his neighbors and he says, a man they called Jesus healed me. Then he's talking to the Pharisees and the religious leaders. And they ask, what's his opinion? What's he say? He doesn't say it's a man named Jesus. He says he must be a prophet. Well, that's a change. Not the prophet, not a prophet like Moses, but more than just, he's not just a man anymore. He must be a prophet. Then in verse 30 and 31, as we see this conversation progress, he proclaims that this man, Jesus, this prophet, has to have come from God. This is what they're debating, and this uneducated blind man with no training, no faith, no hope to start the day is the only one who can say with certainty that Jesus is from God. Others wishy-washy said he must be. But this man, this blind man starts by saying it's a man named Jesus who healed me. He must be a prophet. No, I see he's come from God. And then he meets Jesus. He sees him with his new eyes. He hears his voice, the same voice that called him out of the darkness of his blindness, and declares that he believes that Jesus is the Son of Man, the Messiah, the promised, blessed hope of Israel and the world. And he worships him. He falls down on his knees and bows before God's chosen one. He goes from just a man to the Son of Man in the matter of hours. That's a change, friends. That's a heart change. It's a change the man didn't even know he needed. It's a change he wasn't even looking for. A change he would not have believed he deserved. But that's the kind of change that Jesus brings. And that's the kind of change that Jesus wants to work in our lives when somebody finally meets him. When the darkness is lifted from our lives and we can see his face. Read about a man who underwent a change in his own life. His name was Mauricio Estrella. And he was going in his office one day, and he sat down at his desk, and the first message that came up on his computer was that his password had expired, and he needed to change his password. Now, this was a routine thing. It happened like every 30 days. It was a safety measure. But that sometimes those little things are frustrating, right? You don't even remember your last password, and now you got to change it again. And this was one of those days for Mauricio. He was running late. He forgot to eat breakfast. He had a meeting to get to. All these little nagging frustrations. And then he had a bunch of stuff going on with his ex-wife. He had just been through this emotionally brutal divorce. And he was depressed. His life had fallen apart. And at his workplace, this was automatic. Thousands of people were asked to change their password. What's he going to change it to? And he stared at that cursor that was just pulsating on the screen, waiting for him to come up with a new password. And in the midst of his depression, in the midst of this message, change your password. That word change really hit Mauricio. And he began to think about all the change that he needed in his life. Not the password, but the change that really mattered. So he said to himself, I'm going to use this password to change my life. He thought, how many times do I have to put this word into my screen over the next month before I got to change it again? I'm going to use it as a message to me about the change I need in my life. And he began to think, what would really change him? What would really change his life, his perspective? And then it hit him. And he changed his password to this: forgive at her. The E was a 3 because he needed a number. Forgive at her. Each time he came in the morning, he had to type that word: forgive at her, with a 3. Every time he came back from break, forgive at her. Every time he came back from lunch, forgive at her. For 1 month, this password became a mantra that he typed and wrote over and over again, and it changed his life. He talked about how this constant reminder that he had to forgive led him to accept the things that that happened in his life at the end of his marriage. To accept his responsibilities and to accept the things that he couldn't control. And it allowed him to embrace a new way of dealing with his own problems and his own depression and his own struggles. Now here's the question. Did the password change anything? No. The password was the spittle in the mud. But it was the vessel that God used to display his power. And my challenge to you today is this. We all see the change that we need to make in our lives. I mean, it's not just a change. We all see the changes that we need to make in our lives. Whether it's changes, physically, we've got like this man who is blind. We have these apparent physical problems with our health or whatever it is, and there's things that have to change. More importantly, there are these spiritual changes that are much harder to see. Sometimes we hide underneath all the physical things. It's changes in your heart about how you see Jesus and how you allow him to be the Lord of your life. Maybe it's relationship changes, changes with your kids, changes in your marriage, changes with how you talk to people, changes with yourself about how much you complain and how angry you get at things, or how you allow things to affect you for days, or the stress, the anxiety, the depression, the loneliness, the fear, all those things that can be overwhelming. Whatever the brokenness is that you need healed, the change. Too often, we step back and all we think about is the spittle in the mud. What can I wipe on my eyes to get rid of the blindness? What can I start to do to change the physical things? What can I start to do to change the relationships? What can I start to do to change my heart? But the spittle and mud don't matter. They're just the vessels that God uses to display his power. He'll still use them. He'll use the passwords. He'll use people. He'll use all kinds of things if you let him. He wants to change your life. He wants to change your heart. And so remember the process of change that the blind man went through. Stop focusing on your past, because change isn't going to change your past. It's going to change your future. Start looking ahead. Change will happen in the midst of the problems, in the midst of the brokenness, in the midst of the suffering. It's not going to happen once all those problems are gone. God will use those lowest moments of your life to bring the most significant changes. God is the one working in you. It's not about what you do. It's not about what somebody else does. It's not about the spittle and the mud. God wants to show his power in you. His hands are the only thing that matters in changing your lives. But God does want action. He does want you to move. He does want you to work. He does want you to go wash off the spittle and the mud. He does want you to change the password. There is going to be action required on your part. You don't just get to sit back and say, God, I'll sit right here in my life until you change me. No, you need to get up and move. God is going to show you the actions you need to take, and you need to take them, and then you need to watch what God does with them. God wants to fix those problems. But sometimes it's not going to mean what you think it means. Sometimes it's not going to change the problem itself, but God will change your perspective, and God will change you through it. And people will see it. They'll notice it. They might not always accept it. They may not always be okay with the change. But you'll see, and you'll know it came from Jesus. And you'll start to see him differently. You'll start to understand who he is differently. And you'll be able to say to the people around you, I may not know everything about Jesus. I may not have it all figured out. I may not know all the answers to life, but I know this. I once was blind, and now I can see. I don't know what spittle and mud that God's going to use in your life. I don't know what change he's going to bring or what action he's going to ask, but I know he wants to change you. So I challenge you right now. Those changes that you thought of in the beginning, those changes that you said, I know I need to make. Ask God to work that change in your life. You may not get the answer that you want. You may not get the change that you want. But you'll get the change that you need. And you'll see Jesus because of it. You'll come to know him more because of it. You'll recognize who he is because of it. My prayer for you today is that you allow the hands of God to wipe away the darkness in your life, to bring light to the places that you didn't think were possible, to move on from your past into the future, and for your heart to begin to see Jesus for who he really is in your life, maybe for the first time.